What can I say about Trixie? Whether you love her character or can't quite understand why she's become so popular in the Brony fandom, you have to admit that there were quite a lot of us looking forward to her return in Season 3. Seeing a magic duel between Twilight and Trixie had a lot of potential, even more so because of how Boast Busters had ended. With how Trixie is acting in Magic Duel, we see that she had taken her failure and Twilight's success against the Ursa Minor very deeply to heart. It was something that had changed her life from being an over-the-top traveling stage performer to doing manual labor on a rock farm. The build-up for this episode was more than enough to draw in the audience, and they could have created something very memorable between Trixie and Twilight here. But what is it that people seem to remember most about this episode? When you look at fan art surrounding this episode, what subjects seem to be the most popular? It seems to me that what people remember most are the moments when Fluttershy is freaking out in a funny costume, and all the comics and artwork surrounding the meme, Trixie doesn't trust wheels. For all the build-up and all the possibilities that came with this episode idea, the most memorable bits didn't have anything to do with the magic duel. They could have done so much more with this episode, especially considering the fact that Trixie has an immensely powerful magical artifact and we've seen how Twilight can pull off some very impressive magic of her own. Instead, we get spells where Trixie is throwing pies at Twilight and Twilight is giving Trixie a mustache. I was really hoping for so much more than that here. I also find problems with the Alicorn amulet itself. This is supposed to be an incredibly powerful magical artifact, and Trixie finds it in a run-down pawn shop? I suppose that kind of works, as the atmosphere at the beginning of this episode is interesting to watch, but I still get the feeling that they could be doing so much more with this. The shopkeeper talks about how it is far too dangerous to use, and we can see just how different Trixie is becoming when she is wearing it. Again, it's an interesting bit to the story that drives the plot forward, but I still feel like they could be doing more here. The writers seem to have come up with a lot of really good ideas, but didn't use them nearly as well as they could have. So, what could we do with the Alicorn amulet to make it a stronger part to the story? Well, I'm always trying to think of ways to connect the various episodes and create an overarching plotline. So, I started thinking back to the Crystal Empire episodes. More specifically about how we could make King Sombra more of an interesting villain. He gets almost no dialogue in his appearances, and we know so very little about his backstory and his motivations. And he ended up getting destroyed at the end of the episode, so it seems rather unlikely that he'll ever be mentioned again in future seasons. Personally, I wish that the writers had done more with his character, and I think there was an excellent opportunity to do so during the moment he was destroyed. We see King Sombra cracking apart and exploding, with only a few fragments remaining. But what if instead, at the very moment he was breaking apart, we saw the Alicorn amulet flying towards the screen to an unknown part of Equestria? The writers had already stated that they wanted King Sombra to be more of a threatening presence than anything else, similar to how Sauron was in The Lord of the Rings. Well, if they are going to be making a villain that is loosely based off of Sauron, why not go one step further? Why not make the Alicorn amulet similar to the One Ring of Power? That way, King Sombra's influence could endure, despite his body being destroyed. And as for Trixie, I wouldn't have her come upon the amulet in a run-down pawn shop. I would still have her working on the rock farm, talking to herself about how Twilight Sparkle is responsible for everything that she's gone through, wishing that she could show her up. And then in the course of breaking rocks, Trixie would suddenly come upon the Alicorn amulet. And once she had put it on, and felt the sheer amount of power flowing through her, Trixie would feel that overwhelming drive for revenge. If they took this kind of turn for the story, then it would help explain a great deal more about what the Alicorn amulet is, where it came from, as well as why it is corrupting Trixie the more she uses it. And on top of that, what if during the magic duel with Twilight, Trixie began displaying dark magic in her efforts to gain the upper hand? It would cause more tension during the duel, and we as the audience would be much more drawn in by the story. We would get a greater understanding as to why Trixie is acting so power-hungry and vengeful, because we could understand why the amulet is corrupting her. King Sombra's influence from the amulet would be slowly destroying who Trixie is. Much of the rest of the episode could then play out in a similar manner to how it already is, coming to Trixie removing the amulet in her quest for power. And there would be a much more noticeable change to Trixie once she was no longer under the influence of the amulet. There would be a deep-rooted fear in Trixie's eyes from remembering what she had become. I believe that this could also add a great many possibilities to Trixie's character, as she would have to struggle with a lingering influence from King Sombra, who has been shown to be a master manipulator when it comes to fear. It could create a good story arc where Trixie has to come to terms with herself over a long period of time, unlike the overly quick redemption from Trixie at the end of the actual episode. I really think that there is far more potential here if we were to tweak things around this way. But what do you think? Do you believe that Trixie is the kind of character that should be getting a more prominent role in the overall story? Do you think making a connection between King Sombra and the Alicorn Amulet would make him a more interesting villain? Do you think that Magic Duel would have been a more enjoyable episode with these kinds of changes? I would like to hear your thoughts about these changes, and while you are pondering about whether these ideas would add anything to MLP, I would like to leave you with this final little scene that I also have in mind. In the actual episode, we see Rainbow Dash giving the Alicorn Amulet to Zecora for safekeeping. I would actually like to change that up a bit, by having Twilight come up to Rainbow and asking for the amulet instead. Rainbow would of course oblige Twilight with no questions asked. We would then see the celebration with Princess Celestia and the delegates from Saddle Arabia. And after the fireworks from Trixie, Twilight would come up to Rainbow asking her what she had done with the Alicorn Amulet. Rainbow would be thoroughly confused, as she had already given the amulet to Twilight, and Twilight wouldn't understand where the amulet had ended up. And then the episode would come to a close far outside of Ponyville, where we see a changeling holding the amulet with a cruel grin on his face. I am Dr. Wolf, and I look forward to hearing from you.